Hi there, and welcome to the first lecture of the second chapter in the book, The Genes They Are Changing. And I've entitled the lecture here, Genes, Alleles, and Evolution, because I want to talk about these three terms real quick and define exactly what they mean, because they form the core of much of what is being talked about in the book. Okay, so before we get coding, let's just make sure we have our vocabulary sorted out. Now, evolution is the grand unifying process that is underlying all of biology. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, as has been said many, many times before. From a genetic perspective, evolution is actually quite easy to define. It is the change of allele frequencies in a population over time. So if that doesn't make any sense right now, don't worry. We'll be talking about this again and again and again. But let me just repeat this. Evolution is the change of allele frequencies in a population over time. Now, to understand what that exactly means, it's important that one understands what an allele is. So an allele is simply a variant of a gene. So just to revisit some basic biology, all forms of life are based on DNA. DNA, typically drawn like this here with the base pair, is a fairly complicated molecule, but it sort of contains the instructions to build a cell and to build an individual and to build all the components that later make a living individual. When you reproduce, or when an individual reproduces, it passes its genes to its offspring. So you have your genes from your mother and your father, and they have their genes from their mothers and their fathers, and so on. That is basic inheritance 101. Now, if all one would ever do is to pass on the exact same gene or the exact same genes, then we wouldn't have evolution. Everything would remain static over time and there wouldn't be any change whatsoever. And this is not true for a number of reasons. And the most important from an evolutionary perspective is that a gene doesn't just come in one version. It usually comes in many, many versions, and you have a particular version of the gene. But in the population, you might actually find different versions. So say, we're looking at a particular gene, and we look at all the versions of that gene that we find in the population, and we might find three different versions. So in that particular case, we would say there are three alleles, which means there are three variants of that gene. Now, an example of that in the book that I would like to repeat here is the genetics of lactose intolerance, or the opposite of it would then just be called lactase persistence. So what is this? Well, as you know, some people can digest milk and dairy products even as adults. I mean, we all start out with the ability to digest lactose, which is the sugar that's found in milk. There's an enzyme, a molecule that we produce that's called lactase that is responsible for this digestion. However, after weaning, typically around 2 to 3 years of age, a child loses the ability to digest lactose and then becomes lactose intolerant. And that process is usually complete around 10. And so as an adult, most people are actually not able to digest milk. Now, as this map shows, that is not true in the entire world. So this map shows the frequency over here, color-coded, of lactase persistence. So these are individuals that can continue to make lactase and that can continue to digest dairy products because of that. And as you can see, for example, here in Europe, especially Northern Europe, there is a very large fraction of the population that is still lactate persistent. And the same is true here, parts of West Africa and parts of the Middle East. On the other hand, here in Southeast Asia, in this circle where you have around 40% of the population currently alive, there is very little lactase persistence, and indeed almost everyone here is lactose intolerant, which means that by and large as adult they lost the ability to digest lactose, excuse me. Now, what happened here? Well, we actually now understand this fairly well, not completely, but fairly well. We understand that this version, the ability to digest lactose as a child, but then losing it, that is actually sort of the quote unquote normal state of affairs. About 10,000 years ago, that seemed to be the normal state of affairs anywhere on the globe. And then somewhere in the world, a mutant appeared, a mutant allele, um, and we now know, especially in Europe, that that allele is called LCT star P. Doesn't really matter, but that's the name of the allele that renders its bearer, makes its bearer lactose tolerant or lactase persistent. The individual keeps producing lactase even as an adult and is then able to digest dairy products. And this appeared around 10 to 9,000 years ago at the time when humans started domesticating livestock. And of course, with the domestication of livestock came the fact that milk was a source for food, a source of nutritional energy, and of course, individuals who were able to digest lactose and the milk from these animals benefited from that from an energy perspective. But whatever the reason was that this allele started spreading through the population, it did spread, and that's the point. So the point is that this allele went from 0% to around 35% now in the human population. That is the classical definition of evolution. The change in allele frequencies, and in this particular example, the LCT star P allele, in the population, in this case the human population, over time, in this case over about 10,000 years. Now, why does this happen? What forces are affecting evolution? We now understand there are about four classes of forces, four major forces that affect evolution, that affect the change of allele frequencies. And these are, in no particular order, natural selection, or selection in general. This is the one that Charles Darwin described in his book. And there are other types of selection, natural selection being the most famous ones. I'm just going to put these, I'm just going to put natural in parentheses here. But that is sort of the best known force for affecting evolution. Allele frequencies can change simply because of random chance, and that is a process and a concept known as genetic drift. Then migration, or just anything to do with location and space, is another force that can affect allele frequencies. And then finally, as I mentioned, of course, every allele has to come from somewhere, and that is usually mutation. So mutation is the ultimate force that generates new genetic variation, new alleles. So these are the four forces, and they're now fairly well understood, and we'll be implementing all of these forces in code. We won't exactly go through those forces in that order. In fact, we'll start with genetic drift in the beginning, because I think it's important to understand what would exactly happen if chance, if randomness was the only force acting on allele frequencies. Then we'll talk about mutation, then about migration, and then once we have understood these three processes, we can talk about the queen of these four forces, natural selection. And as I said, of course, a key aspect of this class is that we won't just be talking about these four forces, we'll actually be implementing these four forces and the processes in code in JavaScript. So let's get going. See you in the next lecture.